some of the best players, and some of them have been named best player in the world. We have 2 or 3 of them in our New South Wales team. And those girls, they could just hold handstands, like just freestanding, walk 20 meters just for fun. And I think it goes back to usually early development, giving that exploration of movement and playing. Like I know when I was little, in lunch break, we used to just go do handstands. Who could hold the longest handstand? And that was the game for the entire 40 minutes of lunch. And I've noticed it again. I was working with a development about 15-year-old men's rugby. And I had this kid, and he was a high-level men's gymnast. And just, again, he was probably the smallest on the team, but he would absolutely make impact. Everything he did was just quality movement.
That was Nicolai Morris, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by SimplyFaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology. It is also brought to you by Lost Empire Herbs, and you can get 15% off of your order by heading to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll notice that one of the recent muses of mine, it's not really a muse, it's really important, is just the integration of human movement into a athletic performance-based system, which sounds obvious. But by human movement, I mean gymnastics, roughhousing, grappling, monkey bars, rolling and tumbling and climbing, and all the things that we did as children, or hopefully we did as children, that can make a big impact down the line once we become mature athletes. The question then becomes, well, what if we have mature athletes, high school, college, professional, who are definitely not up on their movement ability? And that's when I think that this stuff is so important. We can serve our athletes in many ways, one of which is improving the traditional lifts and things like that. But a huge untapped resource and area, as I see it, is that of the integration of human movement, gymnastics, and everything that comes with it into what we do as athletic performance coaches. So our guest today is Nicolai Morris. She's a strength and conditioning specialist with High Performance Sport New Zealand. She's the lead strength and conditioning coach with the New Zealand women's field hockey team, the Blacksticks, and she also coaches an international elite high jumper. Nicolai's career origin was as a swimmer, but she is much more than just a sea-based sports performance coach. She's always had an eye for movement. She does a ton of different diverse movement activities in her own training, gymnastics, pole vaulting, and she has taken this love for movement into a multitude of land and sea-based sports. She's worked with swimming, track and field, rugby, water polo, and soccer, just to name a few, and she is a rising coach in the South Pacific. On this podcast, Nicolai is going to go into her progression of gymnastics and human movements from a wide variety of athletes, from younger athletes to older and more mature ones, and how and where these progressions fit in. She's also going to get into some correspondences and correlations that she's seen just in regards to athletes' movement ability and their proficiency on the field. Nicolai is also going to touch on building belief and buy-in in athletes and administration from the perspective of a female working in the industry. And lastly, she's going to chat a little bit about her experience with blood flow restriction training, or BFR. This episode really puts a lot of things that we've talked about before on the show together, and there's tons of practical insights. I know you guys are going to get a lot out of it. All right, let's get to episode 239 with Coach Nicolai Morris. So outside of swimming, when did you decide you wanted to get into strength and conditioning, physical preparation? Was your first love really training or competing, or how did that materialize?
So I was telling you this earlier, my body is not very good for sport. I break down quite easily, being both hypermobile and having what I assume is quite poor bone density. So I was injured a lot as a swimmer. And I always loved the coaching side. Even as a 12, 13-year-old, I was really, really interested in what the coaches did and how they communicated and how they looked at movement. And anytime I got injured, which again was relatively frequently. So for example, there was a period where I could only kick for 5 weeks because I'd hurt my shoulder. And I would just watch the good swimmers and the ones with good technique and watch their movement and what made them good. And I think it was always a fascination with movement. I remember in high school watching movies where the protagonist was meant to be good at running or some form of sport, and watching them and getting a bit offended that the actor they had picked could not move well, and dissecting their movement. So it came back to movement for me at that age. And then when I was about 13, 14, I got introduced to a private strength and conditioning company by a classmate of mine who was a basketballer. And I'd never really heard of strength and conditioning. We'd done a little bit of weights when I was in swimming, well, with one of my clubs. And my very first experience with weights was trying to do a 20 kilo bench press. I was about 11 years old and I probably weighed about 30, 38 kilos. I was very little. And having no spotter and getting told to do the bench press and literally picking up the 20 kilo bar and dropping it on myself and having to get saved. But thankfully that didn't put me off. But yeah, I went to this private strength and conditioning company as my first foray into S&C, and I really liked it and I found it really fascinating, and I always wanted to go into the exercise science field. I knew what area I wanted, but I didn't know specifically what part. So I was dabbling with things like sports psychology. At some point, I really enjoyed that side. And yeah, once I found out that strength and conditioning was an actual profession that I could go down, I contacted the company that I had trained out of just before I started uni and asked to go intern with them. And that's kind of set me on my path.
I like that when you were that young of age, you were really interested in the movement. I feel like I mean, because I love movement myself and all sorts of biomechanics, but I don't know, maybe I was just so like self-centered that I just didn't care. I think maybe that was it. I didn't start really caring until I think I actually had to coach people when I was 23, 24. And I'm like, oh, maybe this is more important than I thought it was. For whatever reason, I wish I would have got that, that early head start that you did. And I know that you're really into gymnastic work and those types of things. Do you feel like that was born out of just this love for movement and seeing how that can fill gaps? Or tell me a little bit about how you incorporate gymnastic work or just work to improve the movement quality, maybe from the general sense of the athletes you work with.
Yeah, so coming from that movement side, I would say I'm a little bit less typical than most strength and conditioning coaches who go into it because they love the weights room. And that's fairly typical for most. And like I do love the weights room, but it's not the be all and end all. And again, my athletes squat and whatnot, but if a squat would make all athletes Olympic champions, we'd have a lot more weightlifters and a lot more people who do weights performing at much higher levels. So I think we sometimes miss that if they can do a squat, great, but they can't play their sport, that's no use. We've got to actually get that transfer and that connection. And that kind of idea of gymnastics being the basis of all movement, in my opinion, you do every type of movement. You're aware of your body and space. If you've ever worked with decent level gymnasts, they don't have to be elite level, but decent level gymnasts in a different sport, no matter if their bodies are too small for the sport or what, they are always significantly better at movement than the others and make up for their maybe size differential by being so coordinated and so able to pick up movement. So that's kind of where I started linking the gymnastics side. And I got really lucky. I worked at a school that had an unbelievable gymnastics facility. And it was a high school and they had a full competition outlay. It was awesome. And they taught from the very first year of school, so prep, all the way up to final year of school. And the boys had to come in and do gymnastics once a year, and learn different movements. And I got an opportunity to learn and coach gymnastics through that program, and seeing how it linked and seeing how they teach really young 5-year-olds how to do gymnastics, as all the way up to how it transfers into the guys who are making the elite teams, and seeing how it could link and make people who are not necessarily gymnasts, but just a normal athlete, how it could make them better. And we developed a program for year 8 and year 9. Year 7, 8, and 9, which were the first years of high school. The gym was getting too crowded and there wasn't enough space to bring every athlete into the gym. So instead we developed this program where those age groups 3 times a week would come either on field into the gymnastics facility, and we'd do an athletic development program. I did this with a guy named Grant Jenkins, and it was such an exploration of movement. So we'd do grappling, we'd do wrestling, we'd do partner carries, we'd play fun games, we'd teach them how to move, but not in your typical, I guess to an extent, sterile S&C environment where everything is done specifically. It was very organized chaos. And then when we were in the gymnastics facility, we were lucky enough to have like a foam pit and rings and bars, and like you'd be on the trampoline into the foam pit, and there were people initially just scared of jumping into the foam pit, and they were doing backflips and things by the end of the term, and you let them go, what's the coolest thing you can do to get in the foam pit? And you get people doing gainers and flips and whatnot, and just getting confident in their body's ability to do things that they weren't expecting they could do. And that confidence really transferred as well. They started believing they could take risks, obviously not stupid risks, but calculated risks, and push their body to a place that they hadn't ever before. So I think that program was really special, and we were really lucky to be involved and kind of create it. And then, I, from there, pretty much used influences of it whenever it was relevant. So my main 3 gymnastics elements that I use are tumbling, hanging variations, and handstand variations. And depending on what athletes I've got, it has a higher relevance. So at the moment I'm working in hockey, and the people it has the most relevance for is my goalies. So we're starting to do some gymnastics-based work with them to strengthen their spatial awareness and body awareness and ability to move from one side of the goal to the other explosively. So it's a bit of fun. I like it.
As you were talking, I had this thought hit me. It's almost like, because I've been thinking about this stuff a lot, and then maybe it comes full circle. It's almost like you have like the force end of things, like the squats and deadlifts and the force plate and isometrics and all that stuff, and it's all good. And then on the other hand, we almost have our relationship with gravity in like the spatial realm. And a big part of the way my paradigm is going in movement, if I have the 2 poles, I have one just pure force, and one I have almost yielding and coordination. It's kind of like you're giving your body up to the power of gravity and space. Kind of like it's like there's a surrender. There's a surrender when you even when you do a flip on a trampoline, something simple. And I think about one of the athletes at the gym I'm working at right now. He just graduated, and he's going to be a Division I running back. And I saw a video of him in the sand doing a back round off to a backflip. And I also, you watch some of the highlights coming out of the NFL. You got these guys doing flips over receivers and running backs doing flips over opponents in the end zone. And it's like, okay, look, like there is, I don't know if we can call this specific truly, but there is something about having that early relationship with just kind of letting your body kind of surrender to working in space that I think is really powerful. And even my kids, like they're 2 and 4. And one of the things I really like doing is they have a little like playset, a little plastic playset and a little slide. And we have a bouncy house type mat at the bottom. And I'll just hold a ball out, and they'll jump and grab the ball and land on the mat. And they just love it. They want to do it over and over and over again. And I'm like, I'm not trying to be that dad who's training their kids, but like they're having fun. So like, let's keep doing this. Anyways, I love the idea of just do whatever, like do the most creative thing. I love that. I think that would be it. Can't we all have foam pits at our gyms, right?
Oh my gosh, it would be so handy. I wish I had that facility that I could just transport, because it's so fantastic, and it allows them to do it in a safe way where they can take those risks, and they didn't get hurt doing it. It was great.
Yeah, for sure. And I was going to say that football player at the gym who can do, I asked him, I was like, did you practice? Did you do gymnastics? Like, he's like, oh no, I just had a trampoline in my backyard when I was growing up. That's it.
Yep.
It's just.
Yep. They just throw all kinds of fun things. And one of the kids that we actually kind of, I guess, talent ID'd would be the easiest way to call it. He joined our group and was just able to do some impressive things, just naturally was enjoying it and trying really quite advanced stuff. And I came up to him and I was like, please, like, join gymnastics. You'll do really well. And if you're enjoying this, it's real fun to learn the new skills, a little bit more structure, but really fun to come and do the gymnastics program. And he joined, and from memory, he made the team and got to compete in the high level competition. And that was just from throwing a couple of tricks in training, which is great.
Yeah, I think at the very least, absent of all transfer, I think so many athletes just are having fun, and then up to whatever you can transfer into. Although I think from what you've told me, at least before the show, some teams like it more than others too. But it sounds like most teams are pretty excited, even like advanced athletes. Or maybe tell me a little bit about like along the age groups. Like, how much are you doing this with, like, let's say a group of younger, like 12-year-old, 14-year-old, 20 post professional. how does this gymnastic and movement work fit in depending on like the level of the athlete?
Yep. So I had a nice period when I was starting out where I was working across a lot of different groups. So I was working across from 5-year-olds all the way up to elite professional athletes, even up to 30 plus. And I worked out initially, I had the mindset of like, oh, they're professional. They shouldn't be doing stupid things like little games. They're not going to enjoy it. Why would I put that in? And I slowly changed my mindset, thankfully. And I don't care if they're 5 years old. Well, 5 years old, obviously, their entire training session would be fun stuff. They'd be learning, but it would be in a fun environment because that's what you should be doing at that age. It's all about play. But we forget that our elite athletes, no matter how professional they are, no matter how much money they're making, they didn't get into sport, at least in my opinion. Majority of athletes don't get into sport because they can make money. They get into sport because they love it and they have fun with their teammates, or it's just about joy. And if you can create constraints around something, a drill or a game, that means they're doing what you need out of them, whether it be you need high speed meters or you need them to be working on hip knee ankle control, whatever it is. If you can make that fun, they're going to buy in, they're going to enjoy it, they're going to want to train with you. So why wouldn't you give them those skills if you can make those constraints around it and do what you need to do? Why would we want to make it boring? We want them to enjoy training. People perform well when they enjoy it, not when they're hating it and not wanting to be there.
Yeah, that's been a huge shift before I was a full-time strength coach, I was a full-time track coach. And in my period of life as a full-time strength coach in the university sector, that was the biggest shift that happened for me, or one of the big ones, was just going from kind of this point where I was trying to hyper-analyze the needs of the sport and make this really, and there's nothing wrong with analyzing, but it was like, to me, that was more important than almost that smile on the athlete's face. Like, are they enjoying this? Are they having fun? Like, and it was almost like, maybe part of it too is you're trying to come into a new place and everything is under your thumb. Look how much of a hard ass I am and whatever. But eventually you get to that point. Look, like, you want those athletes that come in and have this be, either the best part of their day or the second best part. Like, it should be a really enjoyable experience. So I can't resonate more with that, what you just said. I'd love to get into, so you said, I wrote them down, tumbling, hanging, and handstand work. Could you, I know, like, hockey is a big sport you're working with now, which, I mean, hockey and gymnastics seem to you would think they're pretty far apart, but I'd be curious how you're using that with like some of your teams and athletes you're working with.
Yeah, so I think I've used some form of gymnastics, no matter how far-fetched. So some things that I would kind of lean to gymnastics are also things you use in your weight room. So like a dead hang, I use that as a gymnastics progression, as well as just a typical weight room progression. So they kind of merge together. So I've only been with hockey for 4 and a bit months. So again, at the moment, we're starting off more with the goalies. I will eventually do some more gymnastics work and things like handstands with the main players, but we've got to get them to a level where they can withstand that and they're not going to hurt themselves. And I think we need to go back to the basics for that first. Whereas the goalies generally have a little bit more of a need for it. It's more necessary right now. So we did a session yesterday and we did things like animal crawls, we did dive rolls, we did handstands, we did some log rolls, all basic progressions in gymnastics to get them to know where their body is and be able to rotate their body really quickly. But yeah, in things like swimming, I used a ton of gymnastics progressions. For me personally, I had never, ever, well, I've had chronic shoulder pain most of my life, which is the joy of doing stupid volume when I was little. But the only thing that took that shoulder pain away was doing gymnastics, hanging and handstand work. So I started putting a lot more of that into my practice for swimming. I also put it in because swimmers tend to be a little bit uncoordinated in space. So trying to make sure they don't injure themselves on land is really important. We do quite a bit of handstand work and back bridge work for my high jumper. We do a ton of back bridge work. That I found that's been a huge benefit, especially awareness and being able to arch well over the bar. my rugby girls, back when I was working with them, we did an absolute exploration movement in any way possible, which included all three of those elements. And even with rowing, we did handstand work, again, similar to swimming, that awareness of space. And in rowing, it's really important to understand what your hips are doing while you're in the boat. It's a massive protective method for your back too. So being able to do a handstand and be able to tuck your pelvis or arch your back where you need to be able to create that good line was a good one for them. Plus, it adds a little bit of excitement into their training when rowing's pretty straight down the line in terms of what they do.
Yeah, with the handstands and the hanging particularly, so do you usually just start, like you kind of said, like starting with just a hang and then you make it more complex pretty much and just work outwards from the isometrics? Or are there athletes you can just roll into it right away, or how does that go?
Yeah, there's definitely athletes like, for example, one of my rugby players had been quite a high level gymnast. So she was always my example. I'd be like, oh, just perform this for us so everyone else can see what it's meant to look like. But there are some who start almost below the initial progression. And I did a presentation at the ASCA last year on this, and I wrote out full progressions and regressions of where I look to go. But in terms of hanging, I start usually with dead hang. And to be honest, some people can't even do that. You need to have a little bit of pressure through the feet or in a band and building up to working on getting comfortable in like a single arm hang and a single arm hang with rotations and monkey bars and all those skills that back when I was younger, we could just do because that's what the playgrounds were and everyone could do monkey bars. But I think as a human race, we've lost that ability in a lot of areas. You know, it was pretty funny when I was researching and looking for some inspiration for this presentation. I came across this unbelievable video it's in China, and I think it's 70 plus. They have this massive group of 70 plus year old men and women in China who go to this park and do gymnastic stuff every day.
Wow.
And I don't know if you know what a giant is. So a giant is essentially where your body is straight and goes the whole way around the bar. Yeah, there's a 70 plus man just doing giants.
Holy cow. Do you have that video I could put in the show notes?
Yeah, I can send it.
Please.
It's just on YouTube, and it's actually insane. Like people bouncing out of splits and doing one-arm eccentric chin-ups, and like it just blew my mind. And I think it's a mentality over in China and other places like that they don't expect at a certain age. You like, oh, movement doesn't matter anymore. They want to be able to move and move well all the way through. And I think in a lot of Western countries, we kind of neglect that. And we're like, oh, you've hit your age, you're done. You can just relax now and get fat and do no exercise and slowly let yourself die. Whereas they adjust. The movement capability of these people is just unbelievable. And I think we need more of that really into all ages. And I've been lucky doing masters sport and seeing what people at any age can do. And it gives you that mentality of like, there is no limit. If you hit a certain age, it doesn't mean you can't learn a new skill or you can't master something that you couldn't do when you were younger. Age really doesn't mean anything other than it gives you a bit more wisdom.
I started my career in strength and conditioning, having a very manufactured approach to training. You're going to do this many sets and reps of this exercise. You're going to do it like this. You're going to do this movement prep first and everything with that. And over 8 years of time as a full-time strength coach, I slowly shifted into a more athlete-centered organic approach where athletes had more options on how to do things. They could express themselves. They could move with flow. We did more gymnastics. We did more games. We did more organic learning. I will never turn back on that. Along the same lines, I've gotten into a more organic approach of supplementation, moving away from caffeine-heavy pre-workouts into herbs such as shilajit, which you may have heard mentioned by guests on this show in the past as being awesome for strength and vitality. That's why I'm proud to partner with two-time previous guest on this show, Logan Christopher, and his company, Lost Empire Herbs. If you want to check out some of the herbs that have led me into becoming a stronger and more vital human being, ones that I use personally, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. You can get 15% off your order there, as well as get a 365-day money-back guarantee. Again, to get 15% off your order with Lost Empire Herbs and see my top recommended herbs that I use personally, head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. All right, let's get on back to the show. Yeah, I know there's so much longevity and movement too, because this was like 5 years ago. I saw this joke. I mean, the thing is, the further along we go, it's not a joke, but it's like, what's Facebook going to look like in 50 years? It's people are like, oh, I got a hip replacement. Oh, I got this. But then you also think about, I mean, just like the people just posting pretty pictures on social media, like fitness. What do we think fitness is? And you have this idea of what this fit body looks like, but I mean, that is not sustainable. I mean, think about it. Are these people still going to be posting those pictures at 70? Maybe. But I mean, at that point, it's more about, I mean, to me at least, I feel like this is the innate beauty of how we move. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I think that is almost timeless, even more than what our perception of beauty is. I mean, I don't know what it's going to be like.
I've just gotten a massive mental picture of like 7-year-olds taking like butt pictures and things at the beach, and they might interesting image.
70, they say, like, 40 is the new 30, and I mean, who knows what it's going to be then? But to me, that just, there's so much timelessness. I've talked about this before on this show, but like I saw this video of these two Brazilian men in their 60s doing breakdance moves with kids. Like, there's these teenagers, and then these two guys just busting moves, and you hear this saying, you're only as old as your spine. And I'll tell you what, like, I think you talked about like back flexibility, and the wrestler bridge movement is almost my gauge of where I'm at, like just all around athletically, like everything, like just putting my hands lying on my back, putting my hands by my shoulders and pressing my hips up towards the sky. Like you said with like your high jumper, right? Like, yep. If I can't do, like, if I getting worse at that, that's like where age is beating me, I guess you could say. If I'm getting worse at that, because my spine is less flexible, I have less posterior chain ability. So I'm always trying to get that one in there. I do want to ask you before I forget, because you're talking about these movements, and this is something, at least with a small quantity of athletes, and very specifically the men's tennis team that I worked with at Cal. As I was doing more and more and more gymnastics and bar hangs, and I really did, at least with the last group I had, and again, this is an N of 1 team, small sample size, but the guys who played the top courts, we would do like monkey bars and cartwheels and handstands and different types of crawls, and the guys who were the top court guys were the best at all that stuff, and more so than they were the best at the weights or anything else. And a lot of it with that group, it was more like the people who are best at weights are the guys who wanted to be the best at weights, not because it was just, sometimes they weren't going to play, so they're like, well, I'm just going to get swole, and that was their mentality. But I did really genuinely feel like those guys who had just had more movement potential were the better players with that group. And then like the swim teams I worked with, it was like, usually the better swimmers could hold handstands a lot longer. Like they could either hold handstands longer, or they could do it free, without the wall, or there was something about that. And just like, no one who's a good swimmer couldn't hold a handstand for more than like 45, or for, you had basically, if you were good, you should be well over a minute easy in that. So I'm just curious, some things you've noticed with some of the other teams and groups you've worked with. You've worked with a really diverse amount of teams and groups. So do you notice are there any interesting or unique correlations as you've seen throughout the years?
Yeah, absolutely. And you were just making me think then back to, I worked with the women's state of origin team, and some of the best players, and some of them have been named best player in the world. We have 2 or 3 of them in our New South Wales team. And those girls, they could just hold handstands, like just freestanding, walk 20 meters just for fun. And it's just, I think it goes back to usually early development, giving that exploration of movement and playing. Like, I know when I was little, in lunch break, we used to just go do handstands. Who could hold the longest handstand? That was the game for the entire 40 minutes of lunch. And I've noticed it again. I was working with a development about 15-year-old men's rugby, and I had this kid, and he was a high-level men's gymnast. And just, again, he was probably the smallest on the team, but he would absolutely make impact. Everything he did was just quality movement. And maybe didn't have the ability to go professional or anything like that, but he was well and truly going above and beyond what his size and shape should be allowed to do typically, because he was just so skilled and aware of everything around him. And then I worked with a women's rugby player, and the one I was saying before, who I got demoing when I could, And yeah, when she was younger, you would never have guessed it just chatting to her, but she was a super high level gymnast, and she plays for Australia as halfback, and just absolutely can do any movement. And she's just such a well-rounded athlete. Like in the gym, she's a halfback and she's pulling the same numbers as the props. And like the props just give her shit constantly because she shouldn't be outlifting them when she's little, and she's just so strong in every movement she does, and just hasn't done gymnastics in years. So she's in her mid-30s, can easily pull out a backflip or handsprings and whatever she does. And yeah, the ones who do tend to be able to move in those different ways do tend to be quite superior athletes from what I've seen.
Yeah, I saw that when I was working with a lot of young athletes in club track and field, and the ones who you get so many kids who just could barely put one foot in front of the other and probably were sitting playing video games all the time. And then you get a few kids who just everything you ever asked or you just demonstrate it once and they just nailed it. And you would then find, oh yeah, that kid was in gymnastics, the last few years. It was very common for the kids who were in gymnastics. Even an athlete I'm working with now who's just super coordinated and on it. She's done gymnastics a lot as well. And it's just, the more of those you see, it's just like, okay, there's something going on here. So do you, like in your own workouts, like you said, like you're doing some masters competitions, but do you do a lot of that stuff in your own training and your own, I'm sure that's probably where you invent a lot of stuff, right? Like how does that filter into your own work?
I was so lucky when I was living in Sydney. I trained out of a company called Delecki Strength. And if you go on Instagram and look them up, they put out amazing training videos as well that are really awesome to see. But I started training with them. I'd always wanted to join adult gymnastics, and it'd always been too far away, or it just clashed with coaching, and just never found the ability to find it. Like I did a little bit of my own gymnastic stuff anyway, but I wanted to train under people who knew what they were talking about and had great progressions and regressions. And a lot of the stuff I do comes back to what they taught me. They're phenomenal coaches and have a really nice periodized way of teaching people, which isn't always easy when you've got, say, 12 people in a class of varied abilities, and you're seamlessly able to give them different progressions and regressions of the same skill. But yeah, I still do a little bit. Sadly, when I moved to Auckland, I couldn't find a place nearby to do adult gymnastics. I'm still looking, but I do usually go do ropes every week and do some handstands, and sometimes it gets pushed to the back, but I always feel better when I've done my gymnastics work and incorporated it into my own training. But I do need to make it more of a priority. Again, it kind of went to the wayside when I couldn't join people and have fun with others doing it, sadly.
Yeah, I've kind of been in and out of that myself, in the sense that when I was in high school, I was starting to really get into like breakdancing stuff. And I was too tall to be a gymnast, 6'1" or 185 meters. But I always just love watching the fluidity and grace of these people doing breakdance moves. And it's funny because my mentor in the world of like biomechanics and track and field, Darian Barr, always takes things back to breakdancing. And one of the things that just kills me, I'm 37 now, and I can't do this move. I could do this in high school, like just watching and just self-taught. It's like a single leg flare. I could post in the show notes. And so I just cannot, and I don't know why I can't do it anymore. I'm not like, and what am I, but it's funny because I actually do think that I look at it, I like moves that are based out of a crab walk position, where it's like, because athletes who are quad dominant, they can do bear crawls real well, but then the hip dominant athletes are oftentimes better at crab stuff. Like I've seen quad dominant, like good squatters who can barely get their ass off the ground doing in the crab position. I'm like, what's wrong with you? Like, but I think to myself, and so I'm right now, my mission is to be able to do that move again. And I know that what I've lost is actually transferable to athletics, in the sense of, I like to think of it as like motor maps, like motor map on the front of your body, motor map on the space behind. And I think if we're not on it, I just think we lose the motor map of the space behind and all that coordination. And like, and I really do believe that ties into jumping off the run and sprinting and like all these skills. And I think it makes them more elastic in nature. Whereas if you don't have that space behind, everything just goes into your quads. Maybe that's simplifying it, but that's at least the way I see it. So I'm trying to get that move back. Maybe I'll let everyone know when I finally do. I'll have to post
Surely,
it on social media.
surely 2024 Olympics, breakdancing is in. Surely that's you're in.
Yeah, I need something to get better at. I got that does take me to the thing of like, if you miss this window when you were a kid, right? Like this is applicable to the athletes we work with. Once you miss these windows, you could still get better, right? But how much can you get better is I just take so much, happiness if the athlete, like the tennis player who just can't do a cartwheel to save their life, we'd go the whole year and then they do one and everyone, but like, so I don't know how much I can get better. I know I can do that move, but we'll see how much further it gets. I'm definitely pretty driven right now.
I'm sure it'll get heaps better. It's just one of those ones that being an adult and work gets in the way and life gets in the way, but consistent training, like it just makes such a difference. And if you get the consistency together, I bet you'll be getting it in no time.
Yeah. I made some strides last week. I was doing a ton of work, like just with thoracic rotation, like crab position, and spent like a couple hours doing it. And my sprint time dropped actually this week. So I was pretty stoked. Cool. I was like, yes, it had to be because of that. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but it definitely didn't hurt. So I want to make a quick jump. This is just a little sidestep, but roughhousing work. So and this is where I'm really excited to chat with you about this because, you work with both males and females. And I think that there's probably different nuances to teaching roughhousing depending on what gender you're working with, maybe preconceived notions or anyway. But I'll just start by this as generally how to use roughhousing with your athletes, what groups, and just tell me a little bit about that in your practice.
Yeah, definitely. So the main groups I use it for are the ones doing contact. So at the moment, for example, in hockey, we don't do too much of it. It may change, but at the moment it's not a priority. Whereas in sports, in contact sports like a rugby, you have to be good at it. You have to know how to move your body and what way to grapple because you're making contact. But I find that the girls often haven't had that continuous block of contact, or some are coming into the sport completely new. So they've missed a development period of knowing where to put their head in particular. And often in Australia, what happened around my age and a bit younger is if you decided to do a sport like rugby, AFL, union league, anything like that, you did it with the boys until about age 12, and then they go, it's not safe for you anymore. And then there was no women's leagues, and they take people out of it. And then they bring it back, usually mid-20s or early 20s people. There was an open women's league and they could join again. So it's this big, like 8 to 10 year gap or even longer that a lot of people have where they weren't doing any contact. And some still have the ability to know where their body goes, but a lot don't. And especially the ones who have never done anything and are completely new into the sport, they have absolutely no idea. So throwing them into live contact situations is just asking for someone to get very badly injured. And knowing where to put your head is so, so important in those situations. So we did a lot of wrestling and controlled chaos, and progressing it into more chaos work with the rugby girls and giving them exploration of space. But in saying that, the guys, a lot of the time, they haven't always been taught either. It's just been, just do it. And they've done it from a young age. So we had a 19-year-old playing first grade rugby, and he always put his head into contact. And it was so dangerous. He ended up with 3 concussions in a year and having a seizure on the field and having to be like stretchered off the field. And it was because he's putting his head into contact every time. And so just because it's absolutely essential for the women doesn't mean the men shouldn't be doing it either, because there's always going to be gaps in whether people haven't been taught properly or it's never been taught, or even just picked up bad habits. I think it's something that needs to be reinforced so people have the skill to get into those movements safely. And I think that's the key. It's the safely part, because you can go into contact safely. But I think a friend of mine and I were actually talking about it the other day. He maintains, he's a rugby coach, he maintains that no one in an NFL tackles properly because of their helmet. They stick their head into contact. And if they ever played a sport like rugby, all of them would end up severely hurt. And he was like, they just need to learn how to actually tackle properly and they'd be killing it. Not that they're not already. But I think it's an interesting one when you've got things like headgear or helmets, and it changes how people trust themselves going into contact and maybe gives them a false sense of security for where they're going to put their body. So I think, yeah, any sport that there's any element of contact, I think the grappling work is so important.
Would you say just kind of like gymnastics where there's like these root layers that happen when people are children? Would you say it's kind of similar, like people who probably can safely tackle and navigate these collision sports probably had an adequate amount of wrestling or roughhousing with their peers? Like, is that basically, like, I know there's a difference between football and rugby, like you said, but outside of that, do you think that's an essential thing for children who are going to get into a collision-based sport?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it depends on their family and growing up. So you see it, a lot of the families who have a couple of boys, they're just wrestling and grappling. And I've heard stories from friends who have brothers and that's just a part of what they do, or their dad wrestles with them. And I grew up with a sister and my dad's knee's not so good. So we didn't do a ton of that stuff. So I'm not sure how good I would go in those situations. But yeah, I think anything, I should know the research better, but basically even with things like languages, and your brain's able to pick up those skills, in poor wording, stronger when you're younger. So trying to learn it when you're older, you can still learn it. Doesn't mean you can't get as good, but it takes a lot more effort to learn a skill and relearn a skill when you're older than it does when you're little. So if you have that natural base of grappling and playing and roughhousing when you're little, that it makes it a lot easier as you're older to go into those positions and feel confident.
Yeah, I was kind of, you got me thinking. I mean, I'm past this, at least in the terms of the groups I'm training with, but I worked with water polo for about 5 years. And there was just like
sport.
Oh, super tough. And my last 2 years with the team I was working with, like they just had a lot of concussions, like way more than the first few years. And I was just curious, like, is it random, or is it like, and I didn't really do grappling or roughhousing. I did like a couple times with that group, but I'm kind of curious in going back if just noticing trends, like, is it a coordination? Is it just random chance? Maybe it was, or is there like a level of coordination that maybe these just guys don't have compared to other people? Maybe they didn't, wrestle around as much, or I literally have no idea. I'm sure there's so many factors, but it would have been interesting for me to try to draw more of those correlations perhaps in the gym setting.
One of my other teams was also water polo back in Sydney, and we did actually put that in their training as well. Like we'd throw a ball in and make them wrestle for it, and who could get the ball out or who could hold on for 30 seconds, or we'd do tug of wars and stuff like that. And just general bit of roughhousing as well. And it suited those guys. They liked that fun environment. They weren't a group that particularly loved the gym, so making it really enjoyable so they would come and want to be there and also still beneficial to them was really important to me. But it's a really interesting statistic that I know through my work that I've heard the doctors and physios talk about. Since COVID, the increase, so having that lockdown when no one was doing any of their sport, we've had a huge increase of concussions when everyone returned to sport. And that time out without that visual awareness and responding and reacting has been linked. So that was a really fascinating one for me. And I think that's really interesting in terms of making sure that if you've got an athlete or a group that's been out for a while, making sure they are prepared for that, because their natural response isn't going to be as necessarily as reactive as it was when they'd been playing a whole lot more of it. So yeah, that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, it makes me think about like, if you had athletes and they're like in a hall together, you could have to prepare their sport. You need to have them just wrestle each other, so at least they're getting used to like some sort of like you're in a small room, some sort of contact based, fast paced, play based game to get that going again. Now we know. Now we could do that.
Exactly.
Interesting. With female athletes, like women's hockey, for example, obviously not a pure contact, but a contact heavy sport. Do you do anything with that group? And what's the vibe with female athletes in general? You've talked about it a little bit already, but I'm just curious, like if they, mentality wise, I've worked with some groups that's like half the group, the female athletes, like they love it, like they want to like fight each other, and then half the group like doesn't want anything to do with it. Where guys, I feel like it's been more down the middle. Like they all are like pretty into it for the most part. So I'm curious what your experiences are with that. And then like female hockey, for example, what things you might do.
Firstly, I should clarify, considering you're American, and for American viewers, it is field hockey, not ice hockey.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I should. No. I forget that it's an automatic. So for us over our side of the world, we forget that when hockey is said over your side, it's ice hockey, and when hockey's set over here, it's usually field hockey. So yeah, a lot less contact. We do have some girls that love that side of things, though. Even in field hockey, they're the ones who just really have that grit and want to put body on body where they're allowed. Maybe have missed their calling in a sport like rugby, and then others that aren't so much physical. They're more of our skills runners group. But in my experience, it's different in different groups. So, for example, in my soccer team, there was probably about a quarter of them were the ones who liked that physical side. And I tried to teach them, because they do actually get a fair bit of contact in soccer, and they really enjoyed it. And then the others we had a very young, very typically feminine group of athletes, and they weren't so much into it, but it was pretty funny because we were the most physical team, I would say, in the comp. And if someone got bumped and hit on the ground, they'd get straight back up. So that made me happy. I liked that. I'm not a big fan of the rolling around pretending you're hurt side of the game. Not my favorite area. But in the rugby girls that I worked with, they were very much there. It was more, and I guess it is a contact sport, so it's more expected, but they loved that side of things. Anytime they had to do any grappling or wrestling, man, their competitive attitudes came out. They got really fired up, and they'd just go hard. They loved it. It really fired them up, which, that suits their sport, so they picked the right one. But yeah, I haven't had too many females balk at doing that kind of stuff, but it needs to be integrated at the right pace. Like anything, you can't just go from nothing into like full-blown contact and expect that they're going to be comfortable. And just like chatting to those who maybe look a little bit out of their depth, and seeing where they're nervous, and slowly progressing them to where they're a lot more comfortable, I think is really important.
I wanted to take a quick break from the show to talk to you about 2 units that Simply Faster now has out that are excellent for training data collection in measuring bar speeds, sprint metrics, limb speeds, and more. The first is the VMAX Pro. If you're interested in barbell tracking technology that is affordable for the individual athlete in the garage gym, but yet is accurate enough to be trusted by professional teams, then you might be interested in the VMAX Pro. The VMAX Pro is a tiny sensor that attaches to the barbell or even the body to help with lifting and jump training metrics. It'll give you immediate feedback for jumps, lifts, and even measure the motion of the bar in 3D. It includes a travel pouch, and the associated app works on both Android and iOS devices. You can auto-regulate with precision with the VMAX Pro. The second unit is the Muscle Lab IMU. If you want to take your movement training to the next level, then the IMU is something you would definitely want to look into, as it's a pocket-sized sensor that can attach anywhere on the body and deliver research-grade motion real time. With it, you can collect ground contact times during sprints, limb speeds for jumping and throwing, and even support return-to-play metrics. The sensor fuses with the rest of the Muscle Lab sensor system for even deeper insights. You can improve your movement data and get measurement that matters today with the Muscle Lab IMU unit. You can improve the depth of your workout metrics with these 2 pieces of technology. And if you're interested, you can head on over to simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Check out their online store where you can find these pieces and improve the depth of your training metrics today. Let's get on back to the show. Yeah, with the women's team I worked with recently, we had like a spectrum, because I noticed some people weren't. It's always had like, oh, you can play these 3 games. And one was just like, you're just going to play like push hands. You're just going to stand there and try to push the other person over, just only hands can contact. And then like the next level was like, what did I have next? Like you could like maybe like stuff that was a little more integrated with like holding hands and trying to like, you know, tag the other person. And then the full go was like a little small sumo, like almost a sumo wrestling ring. And you had to hip check the other person out of it. And so I had like, some people loved that one and some people hated that one. So it was just funny to see who used what. But what did you have some favorite like kind of setups? Or I mean, as with rugby, was it rugby specific? Or like tell me a little bit about some of the actual sets you and formats you use with that type of stuff.
So, and this is going back a little bit, so I apologize if I forget a few, but there are things like one person lies down on their on their back, the other person lies across them, so like a T shape, and they've got as 30 seconds to try and get up, and the person lying on top's got to hold them down. Games like if they're on hands and feet, so 4 point, and the other person is like holding around their waist and they've got to like hold them down and the other person is trying to stand up, to as simple as one person. So if you've got two people facing each other, you each grab, for example, your left elbow, so your right hand is free, and you've got to try and slap each other and not get slapped. So holding each other back and try and push each other over, things like in push-up position or plank on hands, and trying to pull the other person until they hit the ground. Little competitive games like that is where I would start, into the more like you chuck a ball in there and got two people, and if the person with the ball is still holding it by 20 seconds and the other person hasn't, they get a point, and vice versa. Just little fun games like that where it's integrating into the full contact side, and then it gets more specific to what the athletes need, and usually goes more to the coaching side of things. So I wouldn't go into trying to coach the coaches' drills. That's their area. I don't need to be doing that. But the athletes sometimes would then practice the skills, the coaching, tackling skills after they did my forms of grappling, to get that transfer and get the skill acquisition across.
Yeah, it seems like it'd be a good warm up, regardless, too, if you were going to get into that. Yeah, for sure. I like that idea. And maybe if you have any videos, I'll throw those in the show notes too, because it's like I get it, I can picture it. I really do love the idea of like resisting. It's almost like wrestling in reverse, right? Where like the one person starts on top of it and they're trying to pin them, but now it's the opposite. Is basically they're just trying to keep them from standing up. I like that a lot. That's really cool. Just good ideas here. All right, so a couple more questions. One, and I'm sure you've been asked this question, I'm curious. So like just like building buy-in and trust with athletes, how has being a female coach impacted you with that? I mean, have you faced male populations that it's been more difficult, or tell me a little bit about that process in your coaching journey?
It's quite an interesting one, because in my experience, often it's not actually a male-female thing in terms of buy-in. It's person-person. However, I found the attitudes of either the head coach or the higher-ups, they're usually the ones that think that the buy-in's not going to happen because you're female, whereas the athletes don't have so much of a care. They just want someone who respects them and helps them to try and get where they need to be. So rugby for me is a good example. I started in rugby in, I want to say 2014-ish. And my first ever experience in rugby union, I rocked up and it was me, who was tiny, and over 100 men at the field, not one other female. So it's a little bit of a take a breath before you start when you first go into that environment. I've had a little bit of different stories. Like the guys, I found guys respond better to females, and I've seen guys who respond much better to the typical male way of coaching as well. I haven't had really bad experiences as in they don't respect me because I'm female. I've been really lucky. I think some of the athletes that I've worked with respond to it, my style, really well, and I'll share a story in a second. But I have had issues where they've kind of potentially crossed the line, and I was young enough not to realize that. So when I first started in rugby, one of the guys was real cheeky and would ask me out jokingly in front of everyone, not because he wanted to ask me out, just to get the reaction. And looking back, I don't blame the athlete. I probably blame the people around, going that probably should have been brought up or at least talked to, that wasn't super acceptable. I know it was done in an element of banter, but as soon as that happened, the respect level dropped and it was really hard to get the group back. And I was young enough then to not really say or do anything about it. However, it would never happen to a male coach, and it's not actually an appropriate way to run a session, and it takes away from you doing your actual job. And when you're a young coach, you're like, oh, I can't say anything, God forbid. Like, you've got to let the boys banter and have fun. And teasing and whatnot is fine, but knowing where the level and the line is really important. And again, I think that's more the higher ups probably are the ones that need to step in then, because the boys are just joking around, but they need to be taught what is appropriate and what isn't. And then, I've had experiences, and interestingly, one of my friends has a complete opposite experience. But in rugby, we have a lot of Pacific Islanders, and I have found that I connect really well with them and vice versa, whether that be because they've, and again, this is an absolute generalization, so I'm not trying to characterize a group, but often in their families, the dad is quite authoritarian and their mum is the one that they go to. And I found that may have been that connection, and they liked that style of care and actually worrying about the person rather than necessarily just as the athlete. And then the water polo group I had, they were a different group of guys to what I have coached before, and they typically had hated every male S&C they'd ever worked with. They didn't want to be in the gym. It had taken them 4 years to get the group back to lifting. They point blank refused. And it's one of the best groups I've ever worked with. They went out of their way, and this is just a little bit of an offshoot story, but often as female coaches, we don't get female kit. It's usually oversized men kit that makes us look really unprofessional. And they went out of their way, organized it themselves. And for a young group of early 20, mid 20 boys, this just blew my mind. They went out of their way, got a shirt made specifically as a female shirt to look exactly the same as theirs, but actually in a female cut, and presented it to me. And it shouldn't be an outlier, but that's one of the kindest things that's happened to me in coaching, that they took that extra effort to care that, she would probably want to wear something that fit and look good. And those guys really, just the care factor. And women don't care more than men and vice versa, but it does. Men in the past have gone more that authoritarian coaching. That's been more of a typical style for a lot of people. And my style was a bit different, and really showing I cared. Like, I turned up when I didn't have to. I genuinely wanted to know about them as a human, which is what we all should do as coaches. That made such a difference for them, and we just had such a good relationship between me and the squad, and we ended up doing something that had never been done, and being undefeated champions. And it was it made such a difference. So I don't think a coach is a coach, but people are going to respond differently to people. Like, some women won't respond well to me, and it's not necessarily because I'm a woman, it's just because our personalities clash. I don't think that being a female makes you any worse or any better as a coach, and I think that's important. It doesn't make us a worse coach, which is often assumed, that we can't hack a male environment, or men are going to be uncomfortable having a female around, or it's going to distract them in games, which I've been told by top level S&Cs that you won't work in men's professional sport, or we would never hire a female in men's professional sport because having a female in the changing room would distract the men or whatever. And for me, I've asked men, female coaches, everyone, it doesn't distract them. It's just what they're comfortable with. So if you bring a female in, it's not going to make them uncomfortable once that person is an integrated member of the community. If it's a random female that's just standing in the change room, probably a little bit weird. But we really need to also understand that if we put all male environments, absolutely no females around, and same with all female, the genders are going to act a little bit out of character. Whereas if you put it like normal society, where there are men and women, people will act normally. And I know a friend of mine who was female was working in men's pro as a physio, and she got hired because they wanted a female around so the boys would learn to talk how they should in general society. They couldn't be as derogatory, I guess, when there's a female around, which is good because in normal society you can't do that. So educating them how you should act in day-to-day living, I think, was really important. So yeah, there's a lot of factors, and I should stop being on my soapbox about it. But yeah, I think it's an important one that we need to address in terms of having females around males isn't a problem. And the reverse has never been an issue. We've had male S&Cs for things like professional netball and soccer and all the other sport, and no one's ever questioned having a male in the change room or having a male coach coaching females. So I don't know why it's an issue in the inverse.
Yeah, no, it was a really good soapbox. I enjoyed listening to your story. Actually, it's one of those things where I actually kind of, there's thoughts in my head as, I guess, the host, be like, oh, how should I approach? Because this is I mean, this is an area I don't have a lot of experience with. So I'll just say this is, one, I really enjoyed your story, but two, I like how you said that there was that team who had gone through the male coaches and it just didn't work out. And to me, and also that personality, it's not just gender, that personality is a big factor. And even for me, like one of the things I had learned from Brett Bartholomew is the idea of being like didactic, like not just being the same all the time, but having and for me, actually, one of the big things I had to learn through strength and conditioning was actually too, and working with teams like men's water polo, was having like more of a hard ass side. Cause I actually have always been less like, a little more of a gentle style, more intellectual. And I realized that, but then having to turn it up and be a hard ass too. But then I was turning up to being a hard ass, and then my men's tennis team didn't like that because I was stuck on that mode. And anyway, so I really liked what you said about, I mean, could you actually just go into a little bit about what those things from a personality perspective that you felt maybe specifically the male coaches had failed? And again, maybe not necessarily making about gender, because these are things that all of us can do, no matter, it doesn't matter. Like we all can learn and be better. So you said you'd just like go in the extra mile for these guys. Like what are some things, some gaps that were left before that you think for that population really specifically your skill set was able to fill?
Yeah, and again, it's not because they were male coaches that they failed. It just, the personality didn't suit that group. And they're a group of guys who were quite alpha, but also quite sensitive. I know it sounds a little bit strange. They just wanted people to acknowledge them. Men's water polo, interestingly, in Australia is probably lesser than women's water polo. So they were often getting the scraps. So they weren't respected as much. They weren't really acknowledged. And that they had a little bit of a chip on their shoulder around that. They also had an Eastern European coach. And Eastern European coaches, in my experience, tend to be quite hard-ass. Like, this coach, great water polo coach, but yeah, like would abuse them, and like quite badly, to the point of very, very much aggression, and it could get personal as well. So if they had another dictatorship, authoritarian coach telling them what to do, it just backfires. They didn't have anyone who they just needed to be a little bit softer in their approach. And yeah, the team just didn't like that approach. They also wanted to have some control on what they did. They didn't want to write the programs, but they wanted to have some influence. They wanted to feel like they had some ownership of the program. And like one little thing, and I'm not someone given's probably the wrong word. I don't sit there and, the team just wants this, so I'm going to give them that. But it's about negotiating. And most of them didn't actually like your typical big lifts. I was like, but they obsessed with bicep curls. Typical male. Loved the bicep curls. They would do, I wrote a program, they didn't love a lot of it, but I added bicep curls, they would still do it. So little wins like that. And then they'd never had a strength and conditioning coach, and our system was a little bit different because we were working with so many sports. We weren't always at the sports competitions, depending on which team it is. So water polo, initially, I wasn't needed at any games. And the expectation was I didn't go to any games. But for me, watching the sport, and I'd played water polo, but like 15 years earlier, and needed probably a big refresher on the movement skills and how they played. Because I believe if you watch someone do the sport, you learn so much more than you do just watching them in the gym. That's what they're there for. They're not there for the gym. They're there for getting them right for the sport. So whenever I could possibly do it, I'd go to all their games. And by the second year of working with them, I attended every game. And they started asking me to run warm-ups and things like that. So again, it's not about trying to come in and stamp your authority. It's about little progressions, and eventually you get asked to stay on or get asked for more responsibility, and they really want you on. Like, it was enough that when I was leaving to New Zealand, and this was so sweet, one of the players who I worked really highly in conjunction with and was a phenomenal water polo player, phenomenal person, and he really appreciated my style and vice versa. And he it was about a week before I was moving to New Zealand, and he was trying to negotiate with the club president, who had all the finances, and tried to negotiate for him to pay me full time to stay on as water polo. And I was trying to explain to him that no, I had a contract and I had to leave, but he was like, no, we can get you out of that. We want you here. So it was a slow progress. Like, they didn't really trust me or listen to me that well in the first couple of weeks, but it was about hanging in there and showing I cared about them as both an athlete and a person, and genuinely wanting to know more about them, not just because I worked with them. Like, I actually cared about them as people. I wanted to know how they were doing, how they were going, how work was, if they were coping. And yeah, it went really well. And it just clicked, and when it just works. I can't fully explain why, but it just worked. It was just a good group.
Yeah, I love that. In my own head, I'm going through, you said, like, they didn't like the big lifts, but they liked arm curls. And now I'm instantly thinking of, like, myself being like, oh, what's wrong with you guys? You don't, like, and I'd probably be one of those coaches. And I
would have been too. Don't worry. That was many years of me being like, no, you do it my way. My way is exactly right. And then learning to actually go, if you can get just a little win out of doing something that isn't going to ruin the program, it wasn't the most important part, and you get such a big win out of doing that one little thing that it was worth it. So they always did bicep curls.
Yeah, no, it's that something like that is way down the list of, I guess, technical transfer in whatever textbook is probably going to be the thing that actually is that win. So I like that a lot. Okay, last question. It's like, then that would have been a good place to end. But I do want to ask you one more question. So maybe that's like the crescendo, and then we're like on the downhill here at the little end of the song, so to speak. But blood flow restriction training. So I know not very much about this, but I know I've heard some good anecdotes of some things you've done with it. So tell me a little bit about BFR and your experience and some of the things that you've used it with.
Yeah, so I particularly love blood flow restriction, and for anyone listening, if you love it as well, I highly recommend following Chris Gavigulo, who's at the Queensland Academy of Sport. He not only made his own cuffs, but is, I think, one of the leaders, both research and practically, for blood flow restriction. He puts out unbelievable stuff, and is someone I go to and ask a lot of questions about my own training with it. For me, it just clicked. It was one of those techniques that even before I knew all the research, I was like, this just works. I just get it, and I can't really explain it. But for me, the feeling of blood flow restriction is exactly the same feeling as I get at the end of a race in swimming. And it's an awful feeling, don't get me wrong, but nothing ever has felt like that. And for me, how I connected, and it's not the exact science, but how my brain clicks it together, is it works similarly to that hypoxic nature you put yourself under in swimming. Obviously, because swimming, you're not meant to breathe very much, and you get in trouble by your coaches if you breathe. And it's that same feeling. So when I first started working with it, I was like, oh, this would be really cool to try and do a study and see if it helps. And I had a group of 8 elite swimmers, and we're going to do it post-Olympic trials and go into this blood flow restriction study. Unfortunately, 6 out of the 8 retired, which meant the study was a little bit smaller. And then one of the others, he hated the feeling. He would get super nervous before getting his blood pressure taken at doctors and things like that. So he pulled out of the study as well. So it ended up being one athlete who was also injured and going in for shoulder surgery. So he had been doing, when we did the study, he'd been doing, I think, 3 months of single arm training, just using one arm. He was unable to use the other one, but he had a background in just swimming, so single arm swimming. So it wasn't like it was a new stimulus. And then all we did was a 3-week study, and this was my very poor attempt at a research project. So those real researchers, please don't judge my lack of good protocol. But we did a time trial, just one, which is not great. Then we did 3 weeks of blood flow restriction, 2 exercises twice a week, one upper and one lower. And we had DEXA scanned him and taken his girths. And within 3 weeks, he improved 2.6 seconds over 100 meters in swimming. And this guy was a proper elite swimmer. He was top 5 in Australia. And yeah, that's equivalent to, like, I think 2 or 3 years of elite training. But again, was only one time trial, so there are challenges around that. And in 3 weeks, gained 1.9 kilograms of lean muscle mass over DEXA, and all his girths improved by 0.5 to 1.5 centimeters. And that was just 3 weeks of training. And that was my first kind of foray into looking at how it works from a practical perspective. And I tried it myself. I missed a master's record, did three weeks of training with it before my next comp, and managed to get the record. And again, correlation, causation, you just don't know. There's too many other factors. But from then on, I was super interested in it. And I use it a lot in the rehab sense. We've got quite a few girls who are building quads and things from previous ACLs who use it. We had one girl who had wrist surgery who just did body weight bicep curls and tricep extensions because she couldn't actually hold anything in her hand. So just little elements like that. And then another elite swimmer, I showed him it. I was explaining what I'd done with my previous swimmer, and he was like, oh, I want to try this out. He thought, and again, I think a lot of it was placebo, but he refused not to use it every week. He loved it. I don't know whether it was just the feeling or what. He was like, I just feel stronger in the water every time I use it. It feels great. And I'd love to do a little bit more research, probably on myself to start with, because I'm not actually working with any swimmers at the moment, but doing it prior to racing. I tried it once, but I'd already put on my race suit. So that's already so compressed that it probably wasn't the smartest idea. It didn't feel as good. So doing it before I put on my extremely tight race suit would be handy. But yeah, I think it's got a lot of value. And I think an untapped measure of it is we do so much training with a lot of sports that we're reaching kind of the limit of what they can do. And then adding weights to that sometimes could push them over the edge. Whether or not sometimes you could use BFR to do a little bit less weight and have a little less muscle damage, but getting a similar strength result, maybe in a maintenance period rather than a max strength period. But just different things like that, I think, could be where people start to look at using it in the future.
Yeah, one of the things, I had another question about it, but one of the things you just said I really like is just the idea of, I'm always kind of a save the heaviest weights for like later in the season type person, regardless of like if the athlete's good for potentiation and we can do a heavy half squat a few days before, awesome, let's do it. But I always think about how can I give them other things throughout the year that are still cool and I'm seeing progress that aren't that. So that also strikes me as something that could be done. I was going to ask with that, like kind of along those same lines, the swimmer who set the PR. And I love how your intuition kind of like the way you felt was able to lead you to this, because I've used it before and I was not a swimmer like you were, and so I don't know, my intuition didn't really say anything. So this is interesting. If I was trying to get a really like sick bicep pump, it would be pretty cool. And again, I just that's where, but then I've seen, because I've had the opportunity to work with the 2012 Olympic gold medalist in the 100 freestyle in swimming, and he loves BFR. Like, and I remember one day we were messing around doing like vertical jumps. And he likes to, even if he's not testing, sometimes he would like to walk over just to try to beat people. And he walked over one day and jumped a pretty good jump. Like, it was about maybe a half inch over what I'd seen him do in the past. And I was like, wow, that's pretty good. And he's like, oh, yeah, I've been doing a lot of BFR on my legs. And so, I mean, I don't know, for him, I think it was really powerful and helpful. So I was curious if you did any like counter movement jump tests with that swimmer as well, or if there's any other markers outside of girth and swim time. Obviously the swim time's what mattered, but I'm just curious for other elements.
No, I would have loved to. It was one of those studies that it got a little bit rushed because all of a sudden the surgeon rang and said, your surgery is going to be in 3 weeks. So I had, I think, 4 days to get the rest of the study planned and organized. And I'd been like chilled and like, oh, we've got months to do this. So looking back, that's the kind of thing I would have loved to have added into the study. Also, a couple more time trials to make it a bit more relevant. But yeah, there are things I think I encourage people who have the time and the athletes to do that research, because I think it would be fascinating. And I think swimming in particular, I think blood flow restriction has a real link to, just because that's that hypoxic feel, but you're still burning out a lot of runners, especially middle distance. That's the same kind of feeling they reckon they get. Same for rowing. So I think it's a challenge, because you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but at the same time, you want to try and see if things can be used in a different and innovative way. So I would love to see people and hear practical experience of people using it in different ways. And again, Chris uses it in some really cool ways, and he does it with a lot of the track and field athletes. So yeah, it may be a good one to have a chat with him.
Yeah, for sure. No, Alex Nantera forwarded me his information, so I'll definitely have to get in contact.
Brilliant.
Sounds good. Okay, what were the sets and reps, by the way, for like the was it like higher? Because I think it's usually higher reps. Like, what kind of stuff was that?
Yeah. So the study was, I did what had been done in the research before, which is 30, 15, 15, 15 with 30 seconds break in between. But you can go lower or you can go higher. It's usually, you want that last set to be barely almost gone to complete fatigue. And I think that's the main part of what it needs to be. So you can go higher reps. I know people have gone up to like 45 reps, or you can go like just sets of 10s. I think Chris has done a lot of work with the lower end of reps. And it depends as well if you're doing 30% of their weight or you're going way heavier. And I think there's just a lot of work that could be done that hasn't even been tapped from looking at it.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. With all new things, like, I have no clue. Like, I literally have no idea. So I'm just, it's part of the reason I'm asking these questions. I think it's fascinating. So sounds good. Well, hey, I think that wraps up all the questions I had. And Nick, it was awesome talking to you today. I love hearing about your experiences, and it's a really good chat. So thank you so much for being on the show.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. It was great fun.
That wraps up another show. Thanks for being here today with us. We'll see you guys next week.